Hi, we're here today to talk about Mendel. Gregor Mendel was a wonderful example of a person who had a lot of inspiration and also had a lot of luck in his experiments. He came up with some brand new experiments that had never been done before. He was a monk, and he had kind of a troubled childhood and teen years, didn't really know what he wanted to do, and so finally he decided that he wanted to become a monk. Somebody suggested it, and he became a monk. And he did some experiments that would become the type of experiments that everybody would follow. In fact, you'll see his type of experiments in middle school projects now. And it's really, really interesting how he did his experiments. He selected pea plants, and he was very, very fortunate to select pea plants because they had constantly differentiating characteristics. The peas were either round or wrinkled. They were in pods that were either inflated, like nice and puffy, or constricted. The peas were either on the flowers were either on the axial end of the plant or the terminal part of the plant. So axial close to the inside of the plant, or terminal on the outside of the plant. He had dwarf or regular size plants. So these peas were really, really, they had what we call today Mendelian traits. So let's talk a little bit about Mendelian traits. Mendelian traits are traits that we can see very, very easily today. There's either two choices. So, for instance, I can roll my tongue. Can you roll your tongue? If you can roll your tongue, that's a dominant trait. If you can't, it's a recessive trait. My thumb is straight. Even though it looks a little bent in the film, I have a straight thumb, and that's a Mendelian trait. When you clasp your hands, is your left thumb over the right or the right over the left? Mine is right over left, so that means that I am recessive. The straight thumb is dominant. A curved thumb, a bent thumb, a hitchhiker's thumb is recessive. And like I said, the flat tongue is recessive. So let's talk about one dominant trait today, and that's achondroplasia dwarfism. I'm going to show you how to do a Punnett square, and I'm going to show you the results of the Punnett square. So achondroplasia dwarfism is a type of dwarfism that a lot of you are familiar with because you've watched Little People, Big World. And the mom has achondroplasia dwarfism. She is that type of dwarf. That type of dwarfism is dominant. Now, both of her parents are tall. So think to yourself, well, if it's a dominant trait, then how did she come up with this dominant trait even though she has two average stature parents? Well, it's through this interesting type of occurrence called mutation. And mutation happens once in a great while. And so any of us of average stature could have dwarf children. So let me show you a Punnett square. I had to write it backwards because for some reason this is backwards. Let's see if we can get it on here. So let's see here. So the mutations. All right. So mutations. This is a dwarf person. They have the dwarf gene, which is a dominant gene, and they have the average recessive gene. So I don't think that any of you are dwarfs. Maybe I'm wrong because I haven't seen any of you. But if you're dwarf, this is going to be your genotype, a capital A and a small a. Now let's say that you are a dwarf and you marry somebody of average stature, two small a's. What are the chances of you having an average stature child? 50%. We see it here. Oh shoot, I should add two a's here. So this should be small a, small a, small a, small a. And then that would be average stature. So that's the genotype of most of us. There's a 50% chance of having a dwarf child, capital A, small a, capital A, small a. So any average person can have children with a dwarf and have a 50% chance of having an average stature child or a dwarf child. Here we have the dwarf trait. Just keep it over here. And this is where two dwarves, let's see, whoops. This is where we have two dwarves who have offspring. And you'd see here we have a capital A, small a, capital A, small a. That's the genotype of the dwarf. So here we have two big A's. We'll talk about that in a minute. That would be a dwarf child. We have capital A, small a, and this is supposed to be, got it erased here as I was moving it. Capital A, small a, and then two small a's. This would be an average stature child. And so you could have a dwarf parents that have a child who's 6 feet tall, hypothetically. And on Little People Big World, you'll see one of their oldest sons is average stature, so he's very tall. And these would be the dwarf children, so 50% dwarf, 25% average stature. This equals death. So this is what we call a point mutation. It's a mutation on one small point of the chromosome. And that one small change, that one small point of the chromosome changing causes a change in the body where it goes from being average stature to being dwarf. And this is extremely interesting because it's just one change in one base pair on one chromosome. And as you're learning in chapter 3, you have the A and the C and the T and the G. It's just one of those that are changing. And so that's going to affect them and cause them to be dwarfs. And then if you have two of those, if you inherit two of those, then you end up with dwarfism to the point where it causes death. And this is very interesting because one of the very first genetic tests done was that on dwarfs. They wanted to know if two dwarfs were having a child, if they were going to have a double dominant or homozygous dominant dwarf child, because they wanted to be prepared. They could then choose to terminate the pregnancy or to at least be prepared when the baby was born. It would probably be either born dead or it would be born and then die shortly afterwards. So this is one of the very first genetic tests that was done. And they would check the amniotic fluid of the mother, and they would look at the baby's genetics, and they would see if it was a homozygous dominant or if it was heterozygous or homozygous recessive. And at that point, they could tell the mother and father then what their child was going to be. And I find it extremely fascinating that two changes in two chemical bases on two chromosomes could cause death. We look at these great changes where you have an entire chromosome added, like in the case of trisomy 21 or Down syndrome, where the person is viable, meaning that they're alive and they function. Some people with Down syndrome are high functioning, others are a little less so. But these are Mendelian traits. An example of a point mutation, achondroplasia dwarfism. An example of a chromosomal mutation, the Down syndrome or trisomy 21. So I hope that this has helped you to understand Mendelian traits a little bit, and I will see you for chapter 4, where I will explain a little bit more about some of the topics that are discussed there. And hope you're having a good time in the class, and I'll chat with you later.